morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. In this section, we're going to talk about 5G spectrum allocation during COVID. We're going to divide this into two separate parts. The first off is we're going to look at countries that have had auctions anyway. The second part is we're going to look at countries that have just allocated spectrum without an auction whatsoever. The first set of countries we're going to look at is Hungary and Finland, for those that have spectrum allocation. Hungary awarded spectrum in 700 megahertz, 2.1 gigahertz, 3.6 gigahertz in March, conducted with health precautions. The regulator believed that 5G will definitely play a role in the recovery of the economy. Magyar Telecom acquired 2 times 10 megahertz in the 700 and 2100 megahertz bands, and 120 megahertz in the 3600 megahertz frequencies. Telenor received 2 times 5 megahertz of spectrum in the 700 megahertz frequencies and 140 megahertz in the 3600 megahertz band. Meanwhile, Vodafone obtained 2 times 10 megahertz of spectrum in the 700 megahertz band, 2 times 5 megahertz in the 21 hertz band, and 50 megahertz as well. So what happened? Well, in the case of Vodafone, they went ahead and accelerated the rollout of 5G in many sort of locations like Balaton, which is a beautiful freshwater lake just outside the capital city. But they also brought with it coverage in about 10 or so cities, or that's where they're going. One of these cities is Miskolc, the one up here listed first. Miskolc is an interesting one because it's actually an industrial hub, and they're actually doing a lot in mining, metallurgy, machine equipment production, and those types of areas. The other thing they did is they brought capacity to hotspots, the usual, universities, but also hospitals and temporary locations. On the basis of this, I think we're going to see a lot of IoT and 5G use cases around smart buildings and connected machineries in the case of Vodafone. We're also going to see the operator roll out as stated, this has accelerated the rollout to about 300 base stations across the country. Hungary is a very advanced market in Eastern Europe, and it's really the envy of many neighboring countries. The other one we're going to look at briefly is Finland. In this case, Elisa won 2.5 to 25.9 gigahertz frequency. Telia won 25.9 to 26.7, and Telenor's DNA did 26.7 to 27.5 gigahertz. First with Elisa, we think they're going to be using the spectrum to facilitate the research and development through their innovation center. They have kind of one of the best innovation centers in the country. They're amongst the developments that you will see there is the remote tractor, where this is actually being controlled about 150 kilometers away remotely through AR, VR, and a remote operator. The other one is the 3D computer automated design in construction. We're also seeing 360 virtual reality live streaming on 8K resolution. Elisa is also regarded in the industry and amongst its peers for the smart ports technology. Telia, on the other hand, what I think they're doing initially, and bear in mind this hasn't really been deployed yet. We're surmising what we think is going to happen. Little point of differentiation. Here Telia is going to initially start to look at the fixed wireless access. Look for those white spots where they can give some service for immediate benefit or the tactical deployment. We think Telenor is going to shift all the capex to the 5G network that it has in place. It's going to look to extend this to 20 cities by the end of this year, and it's already starting to roll out 5G to the business circuits. So that's pretty important. Let's move along here. Here's a vision of where Telia sees the market going with regard to 5G, and spectrum, of course, plays a big part of this. We see many different use cases. This is not necessarily just Telia. A lot of operators are seeing the same opportunities: healthcare, energy and water, traffic, smart homes, waste management, training, harbors, remote control of equipment and machines, smart building, logistics, factory production. There's a lot that's happening, and this is very much a recurring theme. In Singapore, it's a little bit different. What they decided to go ahead and do is we're going to allocate spectrum, and we're not going to have an auction. So the Infocom Media Development Authority in Singapore awarded the licenses to Singtel and the joint ventures that are set up by StarHub and M1. The winners were each allocated 100 megahertz of spectrum in the 3.5 gigahertz band. They will deploy standalone 5G networks early in January 2021, and will be required to provide coverage at least 50% of Singapore by the end of 2022, scaling up to nationwide coverage by 2025. We believe, future tense, the use cases will be in smart ports. Singapore has one of the largest ports in the world. I believe it's top 5. Port of Rotterdam is probably up there somewhere. There's also, is maybe number 1, there's also smart cities. That is a huge concept in Singapore across the board. This is just widely shared. This is a big aspiration of the incumbent operator and the two alternatives. And of course, there's a lot going on Industry 4.0 and the automation of the whole assembly lines. And there is some manufacturing that's happening in Singapore, but there's also a lot of companies that are headquartered in Singapore that run manufacturing facilities overseas, even literally quite across the strait over the Johor and into Indonesia. Now in New Zealand, it's a little bit of a different situation. They've gone ahead and allocated spectrum anyway. This one was to Spark and 2 Degrees, plus a UK wholesale operator known as Dense Air. And despite this place being a very small, this is where I'm casting from today, New Zealand, a small developed country, there are many coverage gaps. You do not get access anywhere. It's quite common for you to see holes in your network coverage. I think the use cases on that basis is going to be fixed wireless access, mobile broadband, and they can really do an awful lot to improve public services. Longer term, they make a lot of jokes about sheep for no reason. I mean, for good reason. There's going to be a lot to do with agriculture, with dairy, cows and sheep, and industrial farms. In fact, you may be interested to know that Vodafone has nearly 100% market share in IoT deployments historically. Now, when 5G comes to play, that's going to open things up a little bit. We're going to move to narrowband IoT. We're going to do denser deployments. A lot's going to happen here. But if there's one thing you should remember about New Zealand with regard to the spectrum allocation, it's longer term. It's all about smart farming. Hi, everybody. We're back again. This last section, in terms of the COVID schemes, we're going to talk about temporary relief. I have a few more case studies to share with you. One case study is going to be South Africa. The other one is going to be Ireland. But this is happening in other parts of the world as well, like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Panama, and a few other markets. In the case of South Africa, the regulatory authority assigned the spectrum on a temporary basis to Vodacom, MTN, Telkom, Rain, and Liquid Telecom. They were offering spectrum in the 700 megahertz, 800 megahertz, 2.3, 2.6, and 3.5 gigahertz, valid until the end of November. Demand for temporary spectrum has been very strong. The operators are obliged to facilitate access to remote learning initiatives through virtual classrooms. I will share an example with this on the next slide. This is really important because this is all about keeping our communities connected during times of trouble. In addition, they must not charge their subscribers for access to health-related COVID websites, specifically identified by the Department of Health. So in other words, this is to get the spectrum, you really have to promote zero-rate tariffs, allowing kids to access their schools, allowing grown-ups and others to access COVID-related, health-related websites. Permanent spectrum will be assigned after the temporary release period. One thing that's good about this is you get operators actually trying new spectrum and new technologies before we move into full throttle of 5G. Here's an example, I've taken one at random, is what Vodacom offers. This is their e-learning initiative in schooling. You could see how, very easy to follow a process for learning, revising your studies, maybe taking testing and evaluating and trying to score a decent grade. That's great. You can do it remote. It's a fantastic use of broadband that drives economic growth and GDP growth. The other example I was going to share quickly was Ireland. In the case of Ireland, it allowed Air and 3 Ireland access the 700 megahertz spectrum to meet the demand for network capacity. This immediately supported 56% of the 137 known phones on the Irish market, according to the regulator. It also allowed for new 2.6 gigahertz spectrum to be used in select locations like hospitals. This supported 92% of the available phones on the Irish market. Moreover, it allowed existing 2.1 gigahertz spectrum to be used for 4G in addition to 3G, where it was previously allocated. One of the things that really stood out in this process is rather than having mobile operators run an advertisement, how good my network is over the other's network, all of these operators banded together like brothers. They wrote the same letter to the regulator asking for the same thing. We, the CEOs of the telecommunications industry, would like the following. And they spelled out exactly what spectrum they wanted and why they wanted it, why it was important for the community. They also got the 700 spectrum in the same ranges as the 800 spectrum was already allocated. What we also saw was MNOs really working together on the technical side to make sure that there was actually no interference in band allocation. The regulator said, you guys work amongst yourselves, ensure that there's no spectrum allocation, no interference, and just make it happen. This is one of the great success stories of Ireland, of just pulling together, including the aviation industry. Everyone just pulled together to make this happen. This was temporary relief, and it was much needed in times when we're closing down schools and classrooms and dealing with a lot of uncertainty. Thank you very much.